I just saw an old episode of What's Happening for the first time since I was a little kid. The one where Rerun joins a cult and his buddies, Raj and Dwayne, have to rescue him. It triggered a flood of memories and reflections, which inspired me to summarize in this video. And since I've always been curious about or fascinated with spiritual cults, probably because they reveal a lot about the human condition and about human tragedy, I've intersected with members of quite a few over the years, somewhat as a clinician, but mostly as a musician, because groups looking to expand will sometimes do outreach or pass out their literature at concerts and music festivals. There's also some overlap, I suppose, between fans and followers, between those two worlds where rock stars want to be gurus and gurus want to be rock stars. From Osho to Leto, I guess. But I'll usually take time to talk to anyone who's pushing a new religion or a prophecy. Those can be really interesting conversations. And over the years, I've watched something like the full arc of the cult fiasco from inception to collapse. Zendik Farm comes to mind. I first met some of their crew down in New Orleans at one of our shows. Their founder, Wolf Zendik, had written a book called Quest Among the Bewildered, which developed a small but devoted following, and things got increasingly dysfunctional, especially after he died. His wife and the leaders were secretly breaking many of the rules and ridiculous austerities they were simultaneously enforcing upon everyone else, which is typical abuse of power. The privation imposed upon the members was framed as spiritual discipline, but really it was just budgeting the community sacrificed to enrich the leadership. Or consider Yogi Bhajan, whose face is no longer on the Yogi Tea boxes after countless allegations of sexual abuse from former students. People had given up nearly everything, their money, their jobs, for him, including their own names. But when we hear the really wild, infamous, tragic stories like Jim Jones and People's Church or Heaven's Gate, where the remaining members all die together, then you can't help but ask, how could someone drink the Kool-Aid? And I'll come to that, but I think the more urgent question is self-reflective, which is, how might my own behavior, economic, political, civic, religious, already be cult-like? Because we live in social systems like fish live in water. Lots of cults we can't see. What are my long-held beliefs, unquestioned worldviews? What feels normal or natural to me, but unconsciously upholds a certain social order or status quo? And what am I afraid to question? Maybe because I've built an identity or a community or a livelihood around not questioning it. It's easy to judge someone who won't leave a cult, even though it's harming them. But what are we unable to leave? There's a joke that the difference between a cult and a religion is the number of members. So we're all probably somewhere on the cult spectrum, and people don't see themselves on that spectrum because, they've never been formally initiated into any cult. But what are the social predicaments we're unable to escape? That might help us find ourselves on the spectrum. But let me put a little more spin on this. All words of caution about joining cults should themselves be met with caution, because we've all been warned about brainwashing. There was a good deal of propaganda about this on TV when I was growing up. So let me circle back to what sparked this discussion for me. The show What's Happening and the episode Rerun Sees the Light. Rerun falls in love with a high priestess and gives up eating Twinkies first, and then eventually becomes a full initiate, gives up all his worldly possessions and shaves his head and wears robes and takes on a new name, Abu. And it turns out that it's all a money scam to get a whopping $47 out of him. Well, looking back at this and all media like this differently now, you should check out that episode if you can. It's on YouTube. And notice the identities of the people involved, both the gullible and the fraudsters, and the ethnic and racial tropes, and the words that are demonized. TV motifs like this were presented like it's protecting us, but really it's protecting power. In other words, please also be cautious about not joining a cult. People are not always drawn out of mainstream because something's wrong with them. Sometimes they're drawn out because they sense in their bones something is wrong with mainstream society. And that notion is right on. I've long respected the courage it takes for someone to push all of their chips to the center and honor that intuition wherever it leads. Maybe there's something deep in us that knows this ain't it. This ain't how humans are supposed to live. Isolated from community, alienated from meaningful work, consuming things we don't need and don't understand, watching the ecosystem collapse while, being told that the economy is growing stronger. So when someone says there's got to be another way, that in itself is not irrational. It may be the sanest thing someone's ever thought. If we already lived in an enlightened society, one organized around interdependence and dignity for all life and harmony with nature, spiritual over material richness and meaningful participation, well, no alternative community would hold the same allure. But our baseline is dystopian and spiritually bankrupt. So even a dangerous cult can initially feel like healing. Like, look, they all eat together. They sing together. They're sharing things. They look happy and they belong to something greater. Mainstream society and its systems have failed on all of those fronts, or I'd be out of a job. So yes, there have been bizarre doomsday cults and deadly authoritarian compounds, but those exist for the same reasons we're doomed in the mainstream. The greed and exploitation has no limits. And the sharks, the wolves, they circle around everywhere. And a valid perception can lead to an unsafe remedy then. Someone correctly senses our house is on fire and then follows the first person who claims to know the way out. But there have also been peaceful, intentional communities, monasteries like one I just learned about, the autonomous Mount Athos in Greece, with around 2,000 monks who've lived there sustainably for a history spanning more than 1,000 years. And other communes and cooperatives, eco-villages, and definitely ashrams. I visited or lived at many of them, and some were really beautiful and offered people community and connection and a collaborative way of centering Mother Nature. And we shouldn't reduce every departure from the normal into pathology, because again, the normal is not healthy. The mainstream baseline exhibits many of the same hierarchical and abusive themes that denote a cult. Our institutions extract people's labor, exploit our fears, weaponize addiction, isolate and undermine the true elders and poets and philosophers and artists, and prop up puppets and celebrities and commodify our attention and put people on a treadmill of powerlessness, making survival wholly dependent on obedience to those systems and the authorities that no one consented to or chose. So even the language of deprogramming, like in therapy after leaving a cult, even that warrants scrutiny, because is it deprogramming or reprogramming? Like reprogramming back to capitalism and consumerism and loneliness, back to the institutions whose leaders are never held accountable for their corruption and their crimes. So yeah, beware of authoritarian belonging as a way out, but let's also beware of a society that makes authoritarian belonging feel like salvation. Now, in terms of charismatic gurus who do lead followers like sheep to the slaughter, because I've had a lot of conversations and questions about, was this master or that guide real or fake? Because how could they teach something so wise and also do such harm? I actually think some of the most perilous teachers are ones who really had transcendent experiences. They really saw some truth. like a temporary ego death or a vision of unity or truly felt boundless love. But the thing is, a glimpse is not a credential, nor a teaching certificate, nor a job opportunity. All experiences are points of inquiry, and mystical ones are moments of grace in which the mind gets a taste of the extraordinary. They should humble us, not inflate us. The words human and humble are both derived from humus, earth, soil, like bhumi in Sanskrit, the earth, from dust to dust. Aldous Huxley, in The Doors of Perception, hypothesized that the brain may function as a kind of reducing valve, a filter for what he called mind at large. And I suspect that many people do have unfiltered moments, and their familiar confines of locality in time and space loosen up. It can happen in dreams, in a trance, during a serious illness or a near-death experience, and definitely a brain injury because the filter comes off, or through psychedelics. But in the context of spirituality, like in the presence of a mystic or in sincere meditation or after long time fasting for spiritual growth, that's when it feels earned. When it feels like an arrival at a final destination. But access to any unusual state tells us almost nothing about ethics. My spiritual mentor once told me that some people induce awakened states in themselves for power and dark magic. And that is why the sage Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, he placed yama and niyama as the foundation of yoga. And this is ethics, and it's often overlooked in America. And people go straight to postures, asana, and meditation, dhyana, in yoga. And the very first precept of all in yoga is ahimsa, which means nonviolence, or not harming or exploiting others. But if someone doesn't have long, deep training in ethics, how would they even know this or embody it? There was a non-dual teacher named Papaji who told some of his American students after a mystical experience or awakening, spending like 3 weeks with them or so, he would say, "You are the world teacher." And then basically let their spiritual ego turn into the Incredible Hulk and run roughshod over them, but also over their own students because they had no ethical foundation. The Evolutionary Enlightenment Group was such an example. And that's what makes that whole project reckless, and how the Neo-Advaita movement perpetuated a lot of psychic harm and spiritual bypassing. An awakening can also become the seed of spiritual ego. Like, I'm enlightened. I'm beyond ego. I've transcended ordinary desire. And now I'm qualified to guide everyone else. Only the ego wants to transcend the ego. And some self-proclaimed teachers may have had genuine insight, which actually makes them more convincing and in some ways more dangerous because they believe their own legend. They may sincerely believe that their every desire is none other than God's will. And that distortion can be an outgrowth of an awakening of sorts because altered states of consciousness alter everything about us. That's why they're called altered states. Our instincts and impulses are not constant. Grief, anxiety, illness, they can suppress appetite, for instance. Certain medications or health conditions decrease libido. Mystical experiences may leave someone blissed out for days or even weeks, chanting or singing or staring on a park bench for a few years, like one of Oprah's favorite authors. And during that period, they may legitimately have very little interest in sex, money, power, status, even food. And maybe there's nothing dubious about that condition, but in believing that the state is permanent, believing I'm now above the forces of nature and impervious to emotions. But like other states, it passes and that shit comes back. Sex comes back. Anger comes back. Fear comes back. Ambition comes back. But by then, the mind may have built a new identity around having transcended those things. And their first disciples may have built their lives around believing it too. So whenever ordinary desire reappears, the spiritual teacher has a problem. They can acknowledge that they are human, that the state has passed, and they feel most of the same things all mammals feel, or they can deceive themselves into believing that whatever they want now must be sacred. Like, I'm attracted to my student's wife, but maybe God is asking us to dissolve the limitations of conventional marriage. Or I really want money, reframed as abundance is about to bless our work. But what most people do in the notorious cults, I think, is just hide the contradiction and punish anyone who points out the emergent corruption. But that's not exclusive to cults. That should sound pretty familiar. In many hierarchies, families, jobs, corporations, governments. And this is where spiritual inflation joins the ordinary power imbalances. Like other powerful men mostly who have harmed swaths of others, the guru can weaponize positionality against those who are vulnerable or lost or disillusioned or disadvantaged. I'll explain a bit about this cognitive dissonance. It was coined by Leon Festinger, who was one of the most cited social psychologists of the 20th century. And his book, When Prophecy Fails, is pretty good and examined what happens when true believers are confronted with contradictory evidence. Cognitive dissonance is the tension we experience when our beliefs, behaviors, feelings, or perceptions of reality no longer fit together. The mind and attitude want coherence. So when reality threatens a central belief, we don't always change the belief as we should. Sometimes we change reality. Festinger realized this after an earthquake in India, in which those impacted but unharmed circulated a prophecy of the biggest earthquake that's coming. But why? Because of stress and perhaps PTSD. So they felt anxious afterwards, and the behavior was avoidant. But reality looked stable and safe. So they changed their worldview. And now the ABCs of attitude, affect, or the feelings of anxiety, the behavior, B, hiding and avoiding, and the cognition or beliefs about the environment all align. They're all coherent again. And this is one way to engage with anxiety disorders, is through cognitive dissonance. I saw this with some loved ones after COVID risk subsided. Their anxiety and beliefs about social distance had already crystallized, leaving them permanently isolated behavior-wise. Or let's say someone is a strict vegan activist and falls in love with someone who is non-veg and eats meat. Cognitive dissonance theory predicts the contradiction will probably have to be negotiated and resolved somehow. Someone or something's got to give. The partner may change, or the activist may soften the belief, or they may find some other exception that allows the relationship and their identities to coexist. But in cultic systems, the stakes are much higher. Suppose a guru does start sleeping with a student's wife. The student can conclude, holy crap, this man is abusing his authority and I've given years of my life to a fraud. Or the student can conclude, this is another test of my ego. The guru is teaching me not to be attached. Well, the second interpretation preserves the community, the student's identity, and the meaning of everything already sacrificed. So it resolves the dissonance, but it also permits the abuse to continue. And usually how someone resolves that contradiction depends on how deeply invested they already are. What have they given up? How many relationships or family ties have they lost, have been severed? How much money have they donated? How publicly have they defended the teacher? How much of their identity now depends upon the group being right? This is related to the sunk cost fallacy in economics and psychology. If people halfway through a shitty movie don't usually walk out, well, then, people halfway through a reconstructed identity will find it even harder. But this is where the novices and the looky-loos become separated from the elect or the true believers. Bright red lines are easier to turn back from when you haven't already crossed 100 thin ones. That is how Heaven's Gate ended, actually. The men had already medically castrated themselves to prepare for the prophecy, which required them to become androgynous, to make an evolutionary leap to an alien existence. So many broke away at that point, which was fine with Marshall Applewhite, because he wanted obedience. And if they didn't leave then, how could they turn back after that? And man, that's relevant far beyond religion. But in our political crisis, of course we see candidates not do what they promise. But have you ever seen such a case of doing what you promised you won't? Anyways, followers don't necessarily abandon their values all at once. They acclimate. On the other hand, I think real maturity involves accepting our human and animal nature and then deciding what to do about it through discipline, sacrifice, and self-awareness. If I avoid some junk food or candy, it isn't because I've evolved beyond the pleasure of sweetness. That's wired in as a survival trait after millennia of death by glucose deprivation. Our brains make sugar sweet because we were always way more likely to die from too little than too much. And I'm not going to tell a client something sweet doesn't produce sweetness for someone like me. No, I know sugar tastes good. I'm just working on sometimes being able to take more context into account, the longer term health consequences, and practice a little self-control or harm reduction, not perfection, because I'm human. I once worked with a client who had many psychedelic trips, and he described what sounded like ego death. And I asked him if it led to him overcoming the fear of death in general. He said something beautiful, like, I'm no longer afraid of death because I know what it is, but I still fear dying because that's a natural reflex in the body. And why would that be eliminated? There was humility in that. So I think one of the final lessons here is to beware of the halo effect. Don't conflate talent with goodness. We all have the tendency to let one exceptional quality seemingly illuminate the entire person. And success in this system is not proof of virtue. Yes, someone may say something profound, not just spiritual guides, but pundits, podcasters, influencers, politicians, artists, healers. They may get something really right. Even a broke clock is right, twice a day. But that doesn't make them infallible. The powers that be use this heuristic on us as a pressure valve, only for the revolution to be led right back to the status quo, a bait and switch persuasion of the public, like a grocery store that deeply discounts something you need, only to get you in the door to crucially overcharge for something else essential. In the end, trust must be earned continuously, especially from the people who we appoint to represent us or lead us. It should never be a blank check. So keep learning, never concluding. Even with the greatest teachers, saints, and mystics, don't seek them. Seek what they sought.